Hi, it's Luke here and welcome back after a short break. A lot of things have been happening recently and I hope I will get back to creating video tutorials more often right now. Okay, so let's move on. Today's video will be about Meteor 1.5 and its new dynamic imports feature. So what is it actually? Dynamic imports is a way of splitting your application into several smaller chunks, so your application startup is much faster and you end up with much smaller file, much smaller initial bundle. So let's imagine a situation where you have some website or web application where you have, let's say, 20 pages, sections, or routes, whatever you call it, and each of those routes are very big and they have a lot of code to load. So in normal scenario you will end up with application which has to load everything at once at application startup. With dynamic imports you can just postpone loading those sections or routes to a point where user actually needs them. So user, let's say, enters some page and it loads this module on demand, and that's make user experience much better. There are several tools that handles dynamic imports. One of them is Webpack. And the biggest problem with Webpack is actually configuration. You can end up with a configuration file which is 100 lines long, just to configure like basic stuff. It's kinda hard to understand at the beginning. I wouldn't recommend that to beginner users, developers. I think like there should be no configuration to just start. So that's why I like Meteor. You can just enter this ecosystem, you don't have to configure anything and you can just start developing. With Webpack you have to configure everything. It can take sometimes days, but it's worth using, especially if you're using some wrapper around Webpack, like let's say create React app, CLI tool, so you don't have to deal with configuration. That's definitely great. The other bad thing about Webpack is actually you have to define chunks or bundles by yourself. So it's a lot of work to do, and there are some new ways of doing this in Webpack 2.4. It's called magic comment, and you can just define some chunks just in place where you are importing some modules. That's nice, but it's like not standard way of doing things. And as I said, I think that we should have like no configuration. It should just do things automatically without even thinking about that. For that we have standards that we agreed upon. So yeah, that's my point of view on Webpack. The next thing is Next.js. And they are doing pretty well, especially they are like very new project. I think probably something like half a year, and they have a lot of features that are really nice, and dynamic imports is one of them. The only downside of this framework is that it's only possible to use it with React. So if you are into Facebook ecosystem, that will be okay for you. Development is like very easy, and you have very nice helpers, like let's say this one, dynamic, which just creates dynamic React component from the import statement. So that's nice thing, but you have to use Facebook ecosystem. So that's not great if you want to use, let's say, Angular. It has a lot of other features, but I'm not gonna focus right now on that. But it's definitely worth trying if you are into React and other Facebook's stuff. So yeah, I think you can give it a try. And let's move now to Meteor. As I said, Meteor has no configuration. You just create new application and you start developing. You can use all the ECMAScript features, maybe not all, but most of them, including dynamic imports. It's really easy to use, even for beginners. So yeah, I would recommend that for everyone that is beginner or intermediate developer. There is opinion that Meteor is very slow, especially for bigger applications, and that's correct, especially if you are using subscriptions. So reactivity was a good feature, nice feature at the beginning when Meteor came out, but right now I see like approach into GraphQL stuff. So I hope to see Meteor develop into this way where you don't have reactivity using subscriptions like Meteor subscriptions, but you have React subscriptions on demand. So reactivity is not turned on by default. So I hope it to be great build tool where you can just pick, let's say, React or Angular or whatever tool you want to work with and just develop great applications. So yeah, Meteor is nice because you have this build system where you don't have to configure anything if you don't want to. Of course, you can if you want to. Now let's see how we can use dynamic imports in Meteor. Okay, let's create new application. Meteor create imports. Okay, let's run our application. And here I will mention one thing. When doing this in development mode, we wouldn't have dynamic imports feature. It would be all static imports. So we have to run our application with the production flag, and it will take more time to build, rebuild, but that way we can test our dynamic imports. It's taking quite a long time to run for the first time with your application, and that's a big problem actually. So I will probably speed up this video to don't waste your time. Okay, application is working, and let's see. Yes, it works. So at first let's add a tool to Atom and clear some boilerplate code. We don't need that, and we also don't need server directory. Okay, so we will first create imports directory because we want to use ECMAScript imports, and let's create some roots at first. And let's import them in the main.js on the client. Imports roots.js, and we'll use flow router for our roots. So let's add it to the project. Meteor add Kadira flow router. As you may know, we also have a React layout with Kadira, but it's very old version, so we have to use React Mountain instead. So let's add it from the npm. It's React Mountain. We'll also add React DOM, and React load able. Okay, let's see if everything was added. Yes. And packages, Caldera, yes. Oh, we can actually remove Blaze layouts, so it will be faster to run. Remove. Okay, so let's start creating some routes. First, we'll import flow router from Meteor, Caldera, flow router. And let's define main route first. Let's name it home and action. Okay, and here we have to use our React Mounter library. So we'll import mount function from React Mounter npm package, and we'll call here mount function, which takes as a first argument layout component. We'll call it layout for now, and here we have to define sections in our layout and components that will be rendered in those sections. So I will call this section content, and I will render here home component. I will do the same for second route, which I will call about. Okay, and let's import those modules, those components. So let's first import layout.jsx and home.jsx and about.jsx. Okay, I think that's all. No, that's not all. We have to import also React from React, because we are using here JSX, and in this situation it will transpile it to React calls, so it will just miss this React variable. Let's save it, or maybe we'll just rename to JSX. Okay, and let's create those components. We'll start with layout.jsx and import React and component from React, class layout extends component, and we'll also export that right away. We need here render function, which will just return some JSX. And let's create some div with class name app, and we'll here display some menu. Oops, not that way. And it will be home and about. So we have two options in the menu, and right here we have to render content of our section. As I said previously, right here we have used mount function, which defines some sections. It's called content, and the component that will be rendered in this section. So we can access this section through properties. So we can just render our component using this props content. Okay, and let's create our components. So home as first. So let's call it home. Let's remove that, and we'll just display some text with home Okay, I think that's okay, and the same for about page. About, okay, layout, let's check if everything is correct. Yes, that looks like everything is properly defined. Let's refresh and see. Okay, it can't find imports routes. Okay, I've renamed this file to JSX. Let's check it one more time. And as you can see, we have some content rendered, and we can switch between routes, and it's working. But the problem with that is, even when having like 20 pages, we will load all components for all pages at the application startup, which is not quite best thing to do when application is really big, where each page has like a lot of content. So we'll try to use dynamic imports to postpone loading those components until user actually clicks on a given option in the menu and will be redirected to the given route. So let's implement that, and we have React Loadable installed here. So what we have to do, we have to wrap all our components for each route with a new component which will be provided by React Loadable. I will just create new one for home, so I will call it Loadable Home, and we can actually remove everything from here, and we will use our, I think it's Loadable from React Loadable, and let's export default Loadable, and we have to provide here some properties. The first one is loader, and in loader we have to provide function that will return component that you want to load. So we'll use here our dynamic imports to load home.jsx. Okay, so it returns promise, and that's what actually loader function expects. And the other one thing is loading component, and it's a component that will be rendered during load time. So let's import that loading JSX, and that should work pretty well. Yes, I think that's correct. And okay, so let's define our loading JSX component. Okay, so let's copy this line here, and let's create a loading component which extends component, and let's export it. Of course, we have to provide render function here, and we have here access to two properties that are very handy, and so I will destructure them. The first one is loading, and the other one is error, and it's in the this props. And what I can do here is make some condition if statement to say if it's loading, then I will just return some JSX with loading text. Otherwise, if there is some error, there I will display also some JSX, but this time it will be error occurred, and otherwise I will just return null. And that should solve all the problems, I think. Yeah, let's make sure that everything's on the right place. Okay, and one more thing we have to do is go to the roots, and instead of using our home component, we will use loadable home. Let's see if it's working. Did it refresh? No, not yet. Okay, and let's see. As you might see, there was a loading indicator when I refreshed, just for a very short time. But let's make the same thing for our about component. So I will just duplicate that one and import about component here, and in roots we also have to change component to loadable about. Okay, and let's see. So yeah, as you can see right now, at first page enter we had loading message, but later our components are in the cache, in the browser cache, so we don't have to load them from the server anymore, and we can immediately display content of our pages. Okay, so to make sure that everything is working properly, I will try to simulate a long response time. So what I will do here, I will just return new promise, which resolve function, which will resolve after some time. Let's say it will be 1 second. After 1 second we just resolve with our import statement. So what's happening here? We are returning promise, and we are resolving this promise after 1 second, and we are resolving it with another promise from the import statement. So it will actually, the outer promise will resolve with a given component. So it will be assigned for our loadable package that component is loaded, and we can just display it. And that time it should just simulate longer response time. So let's see. Okay, let's try going to the about page. Yep, it's working. So as you can see, and right now it's resolved, so nothing happens. Okay, that's nice. Let's go back to the original situation where we have just about component being imported here. As we are talking about imports, I would like to show you one nice feature. Probably not everyone knows about that, but when you import some module, doesn't matter if it's static or dynamic module, a variable returned from this module, if it's like not plain JavaScript type like string, but when it's like object or function, it's actually a reference. So if you import the same module twice or 3 times, then they will all share the same reference to the same object. So I will show you on the example how it works. I will create here counter.js file, which will have some counter object, and let's have it some value which will be 0, and let's export this counter. Okay, and let's import this counter in both pages, home and about. So first I will just use static imports, so counter from counter, and the same in the about page. And what I want to do here, I want to increment this counter on button click, so let's add some button here, and we'll add some event handler here, this increment. So let's define this handler. Okay, and what it will do, it will counter value plus plus, and it will console log this value. Okay, I think it's properly written. The same in the about and our button. Oops. Okay, let's check if it's working properly. Okay, we have the increment button, so let's try incrementing our counter, and let's go to the about page and incrementing it. And as you can see, it increments it like it would be the same variable, because it is the same variable. So what's happening here is actually, even we imported this variable from the counter module, this variable twice on both home and about component, they still share the same reference. So that's nice. That's what you would expect from such a feature. And what I did, I actually checked if it's also working with dynamic imports, and it is. So I will show you how. So let's move it here. I will just use import, then, and I will just move this code here. And what's very important here, what will this dynamic import statement return in the then callback function? It will return module, and that's not the default value returned from the counter. So it won't be this counter. It's actually will be module. So we could do something like module, and we could take this counter, const counter equals module default, and it would work, but we can also destructure our module just here. So we destructure our default value and rename it to the counter name. So yeah, default property from the module will be available under counter name. So it will work the same way. Let's do the same for the increment for about page, and let's save it. And if I didn't make anything wrong, then it should work. Okay, let's increment and move to the about page and increment it one more time. Yes, it's working the same way even with dynamic imports. We can improve our code a little bit because right here we are using promises and not everyone is fan of promises. So with new ECMAScript features we can just use async await. So to do that we have to declare our error function as async, and right here we can just replace our then function with await, and we'll destructure our variable, and it should work the same way. So let's copy entire increment function. Okay, I think everything is okay, and let's check. Okay, and let's see if it's still working. Yep, it's working. So right now our code is a lot more readable than using promises, and it works the same. One more thing worth mentioning here is bundle visualizer, and it allows you to show how big modules are and what modules are loaded at the application startup. So let's add this package to our application. Let's add it. Okay, our application restarts. Okay, done. So let's see how our application will look like right now. Okay, so here we have some nice graph of our application and our modules. As you can see, here's a ring for our entire bundle, which is quite big number, but it's just unminified version, so on production it will be much smaller. And here you have some modules that you load. You can see that it's React DOM, Core.js, React, and other stuff. But we also have our application, which is here, and it's very small file, around 3K. So let's try showing what will happen if we increase size of our components. To simulate that, I will just create some data. Let's make it array of lorem ipsum. I think that's good test subject. Let's make it a lot of them. I think that's okay. Okay, and right now when application rebuilds, you can see that nothing really changed. The bundle size is the same and our application is also the same. But what will happen if we don't use dynamic imports, but instead we'll just use regular imports? So let's see. As you can see, size of our bundle increased a little bit. And let's see where we have our application right now. Oh, it's here. So as you can see, from I think 3Ks to 70Ks. So that's quite a lot. And with dynamic imports, we can just postpone loading this data. Yeah, that's very visual way of showing how good dynamic imports are. Okay, I think I will end up this video here. I hope to create more tutorials like that, or let's call it reviews, for React, GraphQL, Apollo, and other frameworks we have on the market. So I hope you enjoyed it, and see you soon in the next video.